right, welcome to my Fireside Chat series. And one second, because we're not, oh no, hold on. Now you should be seeing a map of Oakland County. Are we good, Anna?
Yep, we can see it.
Okay. How? I am the historian for Oakland County Parks, currently at 17 parks. We're a growing park system. My job essentially is for these pieces of parkland to do the history back to indigenous times up to the present. Also in charge of all the historic structures, every old fence post and building and piece of foundation, which is a very exciting job. You see, it's spread across Oakland County. So for most part, I function as a historian for the county also. And today, I want to remind you, 2026, we are celebrating our 60th birthday with Oakland County Parks. So as we do the Fireside Chat series, and in summertime, I'll be doing face-to-face trailside chats. We want to make sure we connect with our 60th birthday. Tonight, I decided for a topic, something that's really important to the history of our parks, our rural roots, our farming roots, our agricultural roots. And I want to just tell you as a beginning that parks are not born as parks. Parks are born as, in our case, they're born as farms. Every one of our parks, even our very urban parks, ones we're developing, those parks all began as farms. And that's a really important part of our history. Let me give you an example. Independence Oaks. Here's 1872 map, and you'll notice that here's the outline of what today is our park. 14 different farms made up the land that became Independence Oaks. Some of them were large farms. The land of Ebenetus Baldwin, whose family came in 1840, he had a lot of farmland that became Independence Oaks. One of the smaller farms, that of Harriet Smith, 40-acre farm. Harriet Smith, one of the few women who were running a farm. She ran that farm because her husband, a Civil War soldier, had died as a result of the Civil War. So every park has rural history, jam-packed history. Some of them not 14 farms. Here's Pontiac Oaks, one of our newest parks. In 1872, there was only one farm there, the farm of Charles C. McCarty, who had a horse farm. And according to records, he even had a horse track on his farm. And that farm will eventually become Pontiac Oaks. So tonight I want to talk about farms and rural history, but it got more complicated as I began to choose the farms and parks I wanted to talk about. It turned out that in one case, a farm was also a trading post, a fur trading post. And another farm I picked actually at one time was a gravel pit. And then another farm that I'm going to talk about became part of it became a human-made lake and a golf course. And finally, one set of farms has a fascinating history connected to the Underground Railroad. So you're going to get stories that really encompass a lot of cool Oakland County history. But I want to remind folks, if we look at the 1877 Oakland County history, which is online, digital copy you can look at, I want to show you what some of the first non-Indigenous settlers talked about when they got here. Southfield Township. The people who got here said, wait, when they got here, somebody had already been growing things. They talked about the usual signs of ancient Indian occupation, and they found maize growing, corn growing. In Avon Township, they talked about the fact that when they got there to farm, the land had already been tilled, made to produce crops. And in Royal Oak Township, once again, they found evidences of cultivation, Indian cornfields. So the history of agricultural and farming in our county goes back way before the farms you're going to learn about today. And I always want to remember and honor the indigenous farming that happened here. and always as a starting point. The farming of the three sisters, corn and bean and squash. But now, with that in mind as prehistory, I want to start with Waterford Oaks. Story number one, I call one frock coat, four cowbells, and six fancy chairs. And it really starts right at the beginning of Oakland County. I want to remind you that Oakland County officially became a county in 1820. But before it became a county, it had the beginnings of a town. That happened in 1818 when a group of Detroiters got together and they formed a company. They called that company the Pontiac Company. And in their articles of association, they explained what they intended to do. And they were, it said, assembled for the purpose of taking into consideration the expediency of purchasing a tract of land for locating a town. In 1818, this group of Detroiters had a plan to grow a town. That was their idea. And where did they pick the land for growing that town? Well, they did it right here in what would 2 years later become Oakland County. They took that land because it was along a Native American trail, the Saginaw Trail, which had been used for 500-600 years, moving from the Saginaw Valley into Detroit. But that was a special place on the trail because that was the place where the Clinton River crossed. Clinton River, indigenous water highway for centuries. And that was where they figured was a good place to grow a town. They named that town Pontiac. Now, that town started with a sawmill. And why? Well, if you're going to grow a town, you got to build buildings. Sawmill makes it a lot easier to saw those logs, those oak trees that were so much a part of our history. And then they built a grist mill long after, and not long after, a woolen factory. But think about this. What do you need to make a grist mill cost effective? Well, you need grain. And a woolen factory, well, isn't going to be very good unless people are bringing sheep there, bringing not the sheep themselves, but the wool from sheep. So what does this tell us? This early town needed farms. A town early on is highly dependent on the farms that will grow around it because those farms are going to bring in the wheat that the grist mill is going to grind. And they're going to bring in the wool that the woolen mill needs based on the growing of sheep. So towns and farms are connected in early Oakland County history. And one of the first families to come out and take farmland was 1819. And that was the family of Oliver and Mary Williams and their children. Now, the Williams family took land just along the Saginaw Trail, just northwest of Pontiac, not far from Pontiac at all. Now, they were originally from Massachusetts. They were from Roxbury, which was just outside Boston. In fact, Oliver had been born in Roxbury in 1776, a good year to be born near Boston. He became a merchant. He was selling hats, among other goods, in Roxbury. And then in 1808, he heard about this growing place called the Michigan Territory. And being an entrepreneur, he thought maybe I should shift my business out to the Michigan Territory when he figured not many merchants were out that direction. So he moved across into the Detroit territory, into the Michigan Territory and Detroit. By 1810, 1812, he decided that it might be worthwhile to build his own ship. He was paying other ships and captains to carry his goods and decided, I'll build a ship. And he built it right along the Rouge River at one of our very early Michigan shipyards. He called his ship the Friends Goodwill. And he was moving goods at that time along Lake Erie. and moving back to Boston. His family had remained in Boston. Mary and her children were still in the Roxbury, Boston area. And he was moving goods from Detroit backward and then goods from Boston into Detroit. But then during the War of 1812, he shifted and he was then moving goods between Detroit and Mackinac Island. And that got him in trouble. Got him in trouble with the British, who took his ship and him, and he became a prisoner of war during the War of 1812. He was eventually released by the British, came back to Detroit, and was operating a small hotel in Detroit right at the corner of Bates and Jefferson. Some of you may know that area, right downtown near Woodward Avenue, running a successful little hotel in that area. And at that time, around 1815, he decided it was time for his family to join him. And for 7 years, his family had remained in Massachusetts. He decided it was time for them to join him. So he told Mary that she should bring the children to the Michigan Territory. Now, he did not go back and get his family. It was Mary who brought her children. She packed a wagon, and they say she was carting a small little carriage behind it, and she packed up her 8 children. The oldest was only 13, and the youngest was only age 1. And it was Mary who made the trip across New York to Buffalo and then on a ship across Lake Erie to Detroit. And we want to remember that when we think about our rural history, that it's the Olivers we talk about and we forget about the Marys. And it's very important because she was the one to bring her children there and to settle her family into Detroit. But then, by 1818, Oliver was hearing about this place that was likely to become a county, and it had a town there, Pontiac, by that time. And he was thinking, wait, there might be good farmland there, and there might be the opportunities for business in that area. So he and Mary took 300 and their children took 320 acres of land right along the Saginaw Road, the Saginaw Trail, as it moved out of Pontiac, with the intent of farming the land and something else, as you'll see in a minute. Their land was right along Silver Lake. Today, it's near the intersection of Scott Lake Road and Silver Lake. Now, with his sons, he started by cutting down trees to make a log structure. With his team of oxen, he cleared 6 acres of land and planted what else but wheat, just as we talked about in terms of that grist mill in Pontiac. We also know that he had sheep. We know that because his sheep barn became the very first school in Waterford Township and one of the first schools in Oakland County. Here was the design of his log cabin. Well, you can't really call this a cabin. This was 20 feet by 50 feet. This was a large structure. This was the equivalent of 3 of the typical log cabins during that time period. And the reason was it functioned as more than his family house. It functioned as a trading post. Yes, a fur trading post. We always think of the Sioux and the Straits of Mackinac, but we had one right on the shores of Silver Lake. He was trading things like with indigenous people of the area, furs and wax and honey, objects that he then took into Detroit and retraded them. So he had a little trading post set up and he became rather famous. Here's someone who visited him who himself was famous. In a book, he said, in his journal actually, quote, "We'd been advised to look up a Mr. Williams who had long traded with the Chippewa. He received us warmly." Now, who was that visitor? Well, that was none other than Alexis de Tocqueville. Some of you may have read sections of his book, French, who came to America to understand America and actually came to Michigan Territory and traveled in Oakland County. And one of the very few people he names by name was Oliver Williams. So Alexis de Tocqueville stopped there at the Williams homestead. Now, Oliver Williams will die in 1834. He's buried in historic Oak Hill Cemetery in Pontiac. Now, he did not leave a will behind. So, in that case, the probate court at the time chose his son, Benjamin Williams, to be the administrator of his estate. And here's what happened. Benjamin Williams, when he looked at the estate, announced, the estate is insolvent and insufficient to pay the just debts. Oliver Williams, it turned out, had died in debt. And what happened at that time? Well, the probate court ordered appraisers to take a look at everything you own and put a price tag on them and then sell those goods enough to pay your debts. And that's exactly what was done. So what you're looking at are the original inventory of the estate of Oliver Williams, which included things like a canoe and one frock coat, four cowbells, and six fancy chairs. Those items were sold for the most part, and then his debts were paid. In the end, the court ordered that Mary be paid the sum of $164.01. I always wonder where that 1 cent came from, but that's what Mary was given out of the estate. Mary would stay for a few years on the homestead, and then she would move into the Hodges house, this very famous large hotel in Pontiac at the time. She moved there for a reason. That hotel was owned by her daughter and her son-in-law, Schuler Hodges. She would spend the rest of her life there in Pontiac. Mary would die in 1860, and she would be buried next to Oliver in Oak Hill Cemetery. I found a wonderful obituary for Mary, and it said her kindness and courtesy to the early settlers won their esteem, and none made her acquaintance who did not become her friends. Another reminder of the role that women played on the farms in terms of helping each other. Mary must have been quite a woman. Well, now what happened to the homestead eventually? Well, in 1853, it was purchased by Levi Leroy. You see on the 1857 map, you'll see his name on the original Williams homestead. Now, I always like to look at the agricultural census if I want to understand a farm. We did an agricultural census in 1850, 60, 70, and 80. And they were a time we counted not people, but horses and pigs and chickens. And we made a record. The federal government made a record of what was happening on a farm. And it turns out in 1860, Levi Leroy had 4 horses, 7 cows, 10 sheep, and 4 pigs. He was growing wheat, corn, oats, potatoes, and buckwheat. He had an apple orchard, and he had produced 450 pounds of butter that year. That clearly was something he sold. These are wonderful if we want to look at agricultural history and what farmers were growing. Now, by 1872, the farm had passed to his son, Abram Leroy. It turns out there's an interesting thing about Levi Leroy. When he bought the Williams farm, he was approximately 78 years old. That's the equivalent of close to 88 now. He'd been living in Avon Township for 30 years. He was a homesteader there. Why would someone move to the Williams homestead at that late age? I don't have a clue. I've been working on that for probably 10 years now. I don't know whether he had a connection with that land. I'm not sure. But he will live there and he will pass the land to Abram Leroy. Abram Leroy will likely build this house. This is a later picture of it. It was brick. I won't tell you yet. If those people who know architectural history take a look at that, it is not Greek Revival. Think about what that house is. Um, it could have been built by Levi, but likely Levi Leroy lived in the log homestead for a while. I've been in this house, met the family, and in the ceiling of this house are gigantic hand-hewn timbers. I think they're actually from the Williams homestead. And unfortunately, there's only one little section when there was a ceiling leak that we were able to see them. Now that house will change. Over time, a porch will be added and it will be plastered over, but it was still that original brick house. If you guessed it, that is a classic Second Empire architecture, which in Oakland County will last from about 1855 to 1885. Um, it's a perfect example of that type of architecture. Here's interesting. Right down Scott Lake Road, if you turn on Watkins Lake, right past our administration building, you will see this perfect example still there of a brick Second Empire. It's a mile from the Williams homestead. I have a feeling the same architect may have built those two houses. Now here's a wonderful picture. This is that house in early 1900s. Right, this is what the Williams homestead looked like in the early 1900s. You'll see right here that dirt road, that's Dixie Highway. Notice it had the stone fence all around the front of it. If you drive down Dixie Highway today, right before you get to Scott Lake Road, remnants of that stone wall are still there. Well, now the house was morphed one more time. Additions were added. This is around 1912, 1918, maybe. You'll see sections of the stone fence. And today, and you notice that if you look closely, the remnants of the Second Empire are still there. Today it looks like this. It's a Tudor style. It has been changed over time from one piece after another. But today you'll see it up on the hill just before Scott Lake. Once again, you'll see the changes in the house. It is very likely that this house is built on the foundation of the Williams log structure. We've measured the basement and it matches 2050 almost exactly. And we know that because we dug up the land there for 6 years. Rich Stamps and Charlie Martinez and Jeff Brieger and others actually we did archaeology there with the kindness of the Salter family who owned that land at the time, attempting to find foundation and evidence of the Williams homestead. We spent lots of summers there doing test pits and doing trenches um, over time. We even did ground penetrating radar on that site. We were never able to locate a foundation of the house or the barn, and that's why we decided the house is likely built on the foundation of the log structure. But we did find things. We found some interesting artifacts. These are the oldest one. If you look at the ceramic at the bottom, that's ceramic in our area from about 1830 to 1840, 45. Here's a special bottle. That bottle has a pontil scar. That's the scar where the pontil, which is what the glass blower used to hold on to the glass, that would be something created before 1860. And here, these are historic. These are kaolin pipe stems. These date in Oakland County very early. These were these long pipes that were so popular. And they were fragile and they broke easily, and people just discarded the pieces put away. So yes, we had farming there, but we also had a trading post. So it's a fascinating, very early piece of Oakland County history. Now I'm going to take you up to Holly Oaks. Holly Oaks is our off-road vehicle park. And story number two, I call From Farm to Parkland to Gravel Pit to Parkland. It's quite a story. Hollyoaks is located here along Dixie Highway. Hollyoaks is interesting because it resides in two townships. Part of it's in Holly Township, part of it's in Groveland Township, which complicates the history of that park because you're dealing with two separate townships who have two sets of separate maps. Over time, had two separate governments for a while. So it complicates the history, but it makes it darn interesting. Now, let's go back to Oakland County. 1820, we become a county. And of course, people like the Williams family travel out the Saginaw Road. And by 1830s, we begin to get farming settlement, non-Indigenous settlement in Holly and in Groveland townships. And we have a series of maps that help us identify those first land purchasers. This is a piece of a map from a book called Family Maps of Oakland County. They're actually, most counties in Michigan have this book. You can buy it at Amazon. Every township has a map that shows the very first people to buy land in a township, the original land purchasers. And for our park, the first people to purchase land were Edwin Fairchild and Marston Richards. They purchased land in 1831. They were from New York. They were living in New York. They never set foot in Groveland Township or Michigan. They were speculators. There were a lot of people in New York, particularly after the opening of the Erie Canal, who were buying land in the hopes of selling it. So these two were doing that. It would take a while before the next people would purchase land that became our park. And that would be the James Luddington family. James Luddington was a bachelor who came from New York and purchased farmland. And when he got there, he decided he needed to marry. And he would marry Hannah Jackson, who was 20 years his junior. And Hannah had grown up on a farm just about a mile and a half away. Her family were homesteaders in Groveland Township. This is a common pattern in early Oakland County. There's no eHarmony, there's no Match.com, so you pretty much married the girl in a farm, a couple farms over. Now, James will die in 1854. He'll die and be buried in historic Hadley Cemetery. Our ORV park is right on the border of Little Hadley Cemetery. It's in our shadow. Now, Hannah will keep the farm going. An example of a widow, you're going to see that happen often in Oakland County. He was older than she was. She will keep the farm going. Hannah doesn't remarry. She'll keep the farm going, but notice what she's done. She's sold off some of the land. So she'd have a smaller farm to manage. She sold off much of it to George Seaman and his family. And you'll notice a little triangle of land there. That was owned by Austin Holdridge. He owned a bunch of land to the west. By 1872, the Luddington family still had her land, but the Holdridge family had taken over the Seaman land and were now farming that piece of land. If we look at 1896, the Holdridge family still has land that will become our park. The Luddington family had sold off their farmland to someone called Mary Sage. Now, I want to tell you something also. Look at the maps I'm showing. Those maps are all available online at the Oakland History Center. It's a treasure trove of early maps, so you can find it at the Oakland History Center site. Now, I want to talk about the Holdridge family for just a minute. North of our park is Holdridge Road. That's the way we sometimes hold on to family history in Oakland County. We take those early farm families and we name a road after them. So we're seeing another common pattern. 1908 map. Holdridge family has now sold to John Lindsay. John Lindsay was a motorman on trolleys in Detroit and decided he'd had enough of the city, wanted to take up farming, and he bought land in Holly Township. Guess what happened with the Luddington land? They bought their land back. They had sold it, and by then the Luddington family said, "We're going to buy our farmland back." And then another chunk of our park was owned by Dr. C.P. Felshaw. He was a doctor in Holly. Now, he never lived on our land. He didn't want to give up his beautiful house in Holly where he ran his medical practice, but he bought the farmland. He had tenant farmers farm the land for him, and he rented out a couple of the houses. By 1925, another major change. Julius Haas purchased much of the land that became our park, and he also bought land on the other side of Dixie Highway. He never lived on the land. He had a huge mansion he lived in. He had one in Detroit and one in Grosse Pointe. He was a very wealthy Detroit banker, and he was doing what a lot of wealthy Detroiters were doing. They were buying up land in Oakland County. Now, some of them were building summer estates. If you've been out to Addison Oaks and the Buell Mansion, built by Lawrence Buell in 1927, he was building a summer estate. Julius Haas bought the land, but his family records show that he was interested in kind of wildlife preservation. And it looks like he intended to build a sanctuary at one time. He bought another piece of land, hoping to do the same thing. It was just south, down Dixie Highway. Here, if you're familiar with the area where Waterford Hill was, he once owned Waterford Hill, and he owned the land where our park was. It turns out he did pass away, and he never developed those wildlife sanctuaries he was hoping to buy, he was hoping to build. 1947, though, his land had been purchased by Michigan and the Department of Conservation. They owned this piece of our land, and they owned all this land to the west of our park, much of which had been the Holdridge land. What did they want to do? Michigan was then in the 40s trying to build these recreational parks. They were trying to hold on to some of this rural land and develop it into recreational space. So now we had farmland turning to parkland. But then in 1962, I-75 was built, and it split apart the state recreation land. And it was not wise to have a freeway cutting your recreational land in half. So the state decided to sell off that part of the state land. Of course, that was the land where our park developed. And we have another change. Now you can see it as farmland, which had become parkland, and now a big change. It's going to become gravel mining. It's going to become gravel pit land. Now, farmers had been complaining about the rocks out there for years. One of the little towns out there was actually called Stony Run, just north of our park. And it's rocky out there. Farmers had hated it, but it turned out to be economically a huge boom. That area is one of the largest gravel mining areas in the entire world. So now we had from farm to parkland to gravel mining. And of course, eventually we would buy some of those old gravel mines and turn it into this wonderful off-road vehicle park where John Noyes and his people are building one mountain and one crazy thing after another. And it's well used and loved. So we went from farmland to parkland to gravel mining to parkland, and specifically an ORV park. So now we had farm, but we also had gravel pits. Now let me take you to White Lake Oaks and the story of why are people swimming in Farmer Van Tyne's cornfield? What happened here? White Lake Oaks, many of you know as one of our premier golf courses. But before then, it was the Van Tyne farm. We have this wonderful photo. Here's the farmhouse and the barn. That farmhouse was located right where our parking lot is today. And just to the west of it, the barns of the Van Tyne farm. Here's the back of that farmhouse. Nice picture, and you can see how the farmland came right up to the house. This would be on the opposite side of our golf course. You can see corn had been growing in that field. This is 1925, but let me show you 1927. People were swimming in Farmer Van Tyne's cornfield. What had happened? What had flooded that cornfield? Well, I need to take you back one more time into time. 1860s, White Lake Township. Jacob Van Tyne had come from New York, like so many people, and purchased this little piece of farmland, 80 acres originally, right on the border of White Lake Township and Waterford Township. He only lived 3 more years. He would die in 1865. And Loretta Van Tyne, his widow, would take over the farm and run it for many years. Remember, we're seeing a pattern here. We forget about the women who ran these farms. Come in March, my Women's History Fireside Chat. I'm going to introduce you to Grace Tobu, who has a fascinating story of how she ran her farm in Groveland Township. But Loretta will successfully run the farm until 1876, when she will pass away. And the farm then will be taken over by her son, Albert Van Tyne. We have a wonderful photo of him from 1910. Likely his wagon here is sitting on land that became our golf course. Here's Albert and Sarah Van Tyne in 1910. You know, there's nothing more important in farm history than seeing pictures, the photographs of the farmers themselves. Now, they had one son, Elmer Van Tyne, who was not interested in farming. He was interested in business. In fact, he was one of the founding members of what became the Detroit Business Institute. He will found it and teach there for some years, but then he will return to his family farm, but not to farm. He'd been watching what was going on in the 1920s in Oakland County. He was seeing recreation becoming more and more important. He was noticing the beginnings of golf courses in Oakland County. He was seeing that our many lakes were now becoming recreation sites. Lakes like Lakeville Lake, which is very close to Addison Oaks County Park. He was noticing Lake Orion becoming popular and Orchard Lake down here in West Bloomfield. So he came up with a plan. He said, you know, lakes are very important. Let me think. What can we do here? Well, it got some business partners and they began to purchase farms, many of them. It seems to be about 12 of them at one time. These were farms that bordered a tiny itsy bitsy lake called Lime Lake. And then he and his partners put a dam on the Huron River and created a much bigger lake they named Lake Pontiac. Today we call it Pontiac Lake. It's a very big lake. It's a human-made lake. And of course, that's why people were swimming in Farmer Van Tyne's cornfields. By then, it was part of Pontiac Lake. But then he decided, you know, I need a golf course too. I've got my lake, now I need a golf course. And so Elmer Van Tyne turned his farmland, the rest of it, into Twin Lakes Golf Course. In 1971, we would purchase that golf course, and now it's our beautiful White Lakes Oak golf course. And of course, when you park in the parking lot, you're parking where the Van Tine farmhouse was. And when you're golfing, well, at one time, Albert Van Tine had his wagon on that golf course. I do want to acknowledge the White Lake Historical Society. They created a magnificent local history book called In Remembrance. All those photos you saw are from that book. It's an amazing collection of photos and histories of White Lake Township. You can get that book at the White Lake Township office. So now we had a farm and a human-made lake and a golf course. And my last story, I want to take you south to Catalpa Oaks. And that story I call A Good Community of People, Mainly Abolitionists. Here's Catalpa Oaks. Isn't that an interesting little park? That is an urban park. It's surrounded by housing, 1940s, 50s housing, a little green space in the middle. And I was researching the history of Catalpa. I went back to this map. This is like the one I showed you for Groveland and Holly. These are the first landowners. And it's section 13 we're in, which is the far eastern part of Southfield Township, bordering Royal Oak Township. Here's our park. And I realized that Andrew Taylor in 1835 had purchased land that became our park. Same year, so had John McClellan. Well, as I began to research these two, I learned the story of someone who had a farm just to the north of them, David Stewart. David Stewart had come to Southfield in 1831. He was a leader in a special church in our country called the Reformed Presbyterian Church. They also called their church the Covenanter Church. He he had a church in New York, and he came with a few members of his congregation to Southfield. And in 1834, he founded a Covenanter congregation in Southfield, the only Covenanter congregation in Oakland County. That church has a long history. It goes back to the 1750s in the colonies. And it's known as being one, if not perhaps the earliest religious organization to take a firm position against slavery. Before the Quakers took their position against slavery, the Covenanter Church did. And then I found a connection between David Stewart and the two people I was researching. Andrew Taylor was his son-in-law and a member of his church. And then John McClellan was another Covenanter leader and actually had been in the church of David Stewart as a leader in New York. But then I found other families. The Parks family. Mr. Parks was another son-in-law of Stewart. And James McClellan was John McClellan's brother, another member of the church. The McClungs were members of that church. The McKinney family, the McLaughlin family, and the Irwin family. They were all farming families. They were all members of that Covenanter church. I was curious. I knew that historically in New York, this was a group with anti-slavery sentiments, very strong abolitionists. But I was curious, had they moved here with those same sentiments? Sometimes people move to a new area and sometimes their values change. I was curious, had their values remained the same? Well, my answer came to another farmer right up here, a small farm, also farmed by a minister, Reverend J.S. Milligan, who was the head of the Covenanter Church between 1853 and 1871. Fortunately, he left a letter behind that described his work in the Southfield Church. And he wrote, I was first settled as pastor in Southfield, Michigan, in a good community of people, mainly abolitionists. So it turned out, yes, these people were still strongly opposed to slavery. But now they were anti-slavery. But how active were they? There were a lot of people in Oakland County who were opposed, but were quietly opposed to slavery and never took an active role to push back against it. But his letter went on to say, and had in my house or in my congregation always a supply of, quote, escaped slaves. So it turned out this congregation were very actively involved in the Underground Railroad. Just a reminder, the Underground Railroad was a group of abolitionists like these Southfield folks, not just people, but places like the church these people had, they built in 1840, like their barns and their houses, places that were helping freedom seekers who were leaving the South, courageously leaving the South in an attempt to get to freedom in the North. And it was dangerous work for both the freedom seekers and the abolitionists. That's because in 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act had been passed, which made it law that any escaped persons found in free states had to be returned to their owners. In addition, it increased the penalties for those for helping freedom seekers. Penalties for assisting were as high as $1,000. Now, today, the equivalent of $38,000. Think of that for these farming families. You were taking a huge risk for helping. You were taking an even bigger risk for trying to utilize the Underground Railroad as a freedom seeker. And of course, we want to know that the goal was not Michigan. The ultimate goal was Canada. Canada had outlawed enslavement in 1834. So really freedom meant getting to Canada, which is why Detroit was the gateway to freedom, because the Detroit River here, similar to crossing the Ohio earlier on, it was the way to cross to Canada and was the gateway to freedom. And that made Reverend Milligan and his congregation hugely important. Why? Proximity to Detroit, where you could move people at night into the Detroit area and across the river. Now, the Covenanter Church, the 1841, of course, was utilized by the abolitionists. This church is on the same site as the church. So not this building, but the former building. But it's at this church where the historical signage is, honoring the role that church took in the Underground Railroad. This is one of the very few sites in Oakland County, we only have 4 of them, that are part of the National Underground Railroad Network to Freedom. This is a series of sites that are recognized for having a verifiable connection to the Underground Railroad. What this means is documented evidence. Evidence that doesn't say, well, Aunt Tilly said that Grandma said it was on the Underground Railroad. No, this is verifiable connection. That letter I showed you that Reverend Milligan wrote is verifiable evidence that this church took part in the Underground Railroad. But here's another part of the story that's important. Let me show you the 1860 Southfield census. Here, working as a farm laborer, was George Riley, age 37, Black, born in Kentucky. Living next door in the Stewart family farm, we have George Taylor, age 35, Black, born in Kentucky. Here we have William, who even report a last name, age 30, Black, born in Kentucky. And besides these people, we have other people from Missouri, Virginia, and other in Kentucky. These were freedom seekers who had been sheltered on these farms, and then in 1860 were actually still living on these farms. This is a really important part of that story. And remember, they were living in a good community of people, mainly abolitionists. So we have a farm story, but we have a much more interesting story to me, how these farmers were involved in the Underground Railroad. And I just want to remind you that the abolitionist story is really important. My own research deals with the freedom seekers, a harder group to research. And that will lead me to my ending tonight and invite you to come February 25th when I will be telling the story of Mary Parker and her family. Mary Parker and her children were enslaved in West Virginia, made their way utilizing the Underground Railroad into Michigan, into Oakland County, where they would find a home in Pontiac, Michigan. So I'll be sharing Mary's story, a fascinating story of her, she and her children. And also, two trips I made to West Virginia this year, trying to understand more about Mary in search of the land where she was enslaved and some historical records. So I hope you'll join me in February.